Imagine London, 1840. You aren't walking into a hospital. You're walking into a butcher shop that smells of lavender, stale tobacco, and rotting gangrene. There is no going under. There is no white-clad nurse to hold your hand. There is only a wooden table, scarred by the serrated edges of bone saws, a set of heavy leather straps, and the man standing over you with a glint in his eye and a blade in his teeth. His name is Robert Liston. In the prestigious circles of the West End, they call him the fastest knife in the city. But make no mistake, Liston is not a man of delicate touch. He is a force of nature. In a world where anesthesia is a fairy tale, speed is the only mercy. Liston's operating theater is a spectacle. It's built like a Roman arena. Tiers of wooden benches packed with medical students, curious aristocrats, and bored journalists, all leaning forward to catch a spray of blood. Liston steps into the center, strips off his coat, and rolls up his sleeves. He doesn't wash his hands. Why would he? The germ theory of disease is decades away. In 1840, a surgeon's coat, stiff with the dried blood of 100 previous patients, is a badge of honor. The crustier the coat, the more experienced the man. He looks at the crowd, clicks his stopwatch, and bellows, "Time me, gentlemen, time me." Before you can even draw a breath to scream, Liston has the knife in his mouth to keep his hands free. He grips your leg. The friction of the blade against the skin makes a sound like tearing silk. Then comes the saw, the rhythmic chirp, 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 as it bites into the femur. This was the heroic age of medicine, a time when a surgeon's greatest skill wasn't his knowledge of anatomy, but the thickness of his skin and the callousness of his heart. You had to be a monster to save a life. If you hesitated for a second, if you stopped because the patient begged for death, the patient would die of shock right there on the table. So you cut. You cut fast and you cut hard. Liston once amputated a leg in 28 seconds. He was so blindingly fast that he accidentally took off his assistant's fingers along with the patient's limb. In the frantic swing of his blade, he also slashed through the coattails of a distinguished spectator. The spectator, convinced the knife had pierced his vitals, dropped dead of a heart attack on the spot. The patient and the assistant died later of gangrene. To this day, it remains the only surgical procedure in history with a 300% mortality rate. But why? Why did it take us thousands of years to realize that cutting a conscious human being was a bad idea? The answer isn't that we were stupid, it's that we were convinced that pain was sacred. In the mid-19th century, the medical establishment didn't view pain as a side effect. They viewed it as a vital force. Doctors genuinely argued that the scream of a patient was a sign of a healthy nervous system. If you didn't feel the agony, they believed your body wouldn't have the vital energy to knit its wounds back together. Pain was the spark that kept the soul tethered to the meat. There was also a dark, religious undertone. "In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children," the Bible said. To bypass the agony of childbirth or the torture of the surgeon's knife was seen by many as an act of rebellion against God's design. If the Almighty intended for us to bypass the blade's sting, why did he weave such a complex web of nerves beneath our skin? So for centuries we looked for solutions that were often as dangerous as the surgery itself. In the dark corners of history, we find the sponge somnifera, a medieval concoction of opium, mandrake, hemlock, and ivy. You soaked a sponge in this chemical cocktail, dried it in the sun, and when the time came, you dipped it in hot water and held it under the patient's nose. It sounds merciful. It wasn't. The dosage was a complete gamble. If the sponge was too weak, the patient woke up while their ribs were being cracked open. If it was too strong, the sleep became permanent. The mandrake root, a key ingredient, contains scopolamine, a toxin that causes hallucinations, blurred vision, and, in high doses, stops the heart. Most surgeons eventually gave up on the sponge. It was easier to just give the patient a bottle of cheap gin, put a leather bit in their mouth, and hire 4 massive orderlies to sit on their chest. This was the status quo, a world of screaming men and weeping doctors, a world where a simple bladder stone was a death sentence because no one could endure the 20 minutes of conscious torture required to remove it. We were waiting for a miracle, but when that miracle finally arrived, it didn't come from a grand medical university. It came from the most unlikely place imaginable, a traveling circus of laughing gas and a failed dentist with a point to prove. By the early 1800s, the scientific world was sitting on a miracle it didn't know how to use. Chemistry was the new magic. In dark, cramped laboratories, men with stained fingers were isolating gases that seemed to defy the laws of nature. One of these men was Humphrey Davy, a brilliant, restless chemist who spent his days huffing nitrous oxide, what we now call laughing gas. Davy wasn't trying to save lives. He was trying to find a new way to get high. He described the sensation as a highly pleasurable thrilling, a celestial bypass of reality. He even noted, almost as a footnote in 1799, that the gas seemed to destroy physical pain. But Davy was a man of his time. He didn't see a surgical tool, he saw a party trick. He invited the poets and the elite of London to his pneumatic institution to inhale the gas through silk bags. They giggled, they danced, and they wrote terrible poetry. For 40 years, anesthesia remained a toy for the rich and a gimmick for the desperate. Fast forward to 1844. We are in Hartford, Connecticut. The air is thick with the smell of horse manure and cheap coal. A professor named Gardner Colton is putting on an exhibition. The headline, "A Grand Exhibition of the Effects Produced by Inhaling Nitrous Oxide." In the mid-19th century, this was the equivalent of a rock concert. People paid 25 cents to watch their neighbors turn into idiots. You'd sit on a stage, take a deep hit from a bag of gas, and then, depending on your personality, you'd either start reciting Shakespeare, try to fight a shadow, or collapse in a fit of hysterical laughter. In the audience that night sat a dentist named Horace Wells. Wells was a sensitive man, a rare trait for a dentist in an era when dentistry mostly involved a pair of rusty pliers and a lot of brute force. He hated the screams of his patients. He hated the way they looked at him with betrayal in their eyes as he shattered their jawbones to remove a molar. That night, Wells watched a man named Samuel Cooley take a massive dose of the gas. Cooley went wild. He began dancing frantically across the stage, tripping over benches and slamming his shins against heavy wooden chairs. The audience roared. But Wells noticed something that no one else did. Cooley's shins were bleeding, the skin was torn, and the bone was bruised. Yet Cooley was still smiling. He was still laughing. When the gas wore off, Wells pulled Cooley aside. "Did you feel that?" Wells asked, pointing to the blood. Cooley looked down at his ruined legs with genuine confusion. "I didn't feel a thing," he replied. At that moment, the history of the world shifted. Wells didn't sleep that night. He saw a future where surgery wasn't a nightmare. The very next day, he decided to test his theory, not on a patient, but on himself. He recruited Colton, the showman, to provide the gas and another dentist to pull his own healthy tooth. Wells went under. The pliers gripped the tooth. The bone cracked. Wells woke up a few minutes later, spat out a mouthful of blood, and exclaimed, "A new era in tooth pulling." But here is where the story turns into a tragedy. Wells was an idealist, not a businessman. He rushed to Boston to demonstrate his miracle at Harvard Medical School in the famous Ether Dome. He was surrounded by cynical medical students and the greatest surgeons of the age. Men like John Collins Warren, who had spent decades listening to screams and didn't believe in fairy tales. The demonstration was a disaster. The patient, a young boy, wasn't given enough gas. As Wells began to pull the tooth, the boy let out a piercing shriek. The medical students erupted in hoots and whistles. "Humbug!" they shouted. "Humbug!" Wells was chased out of the hall, humiliated. He crawled back to Hartford, his reputation in tatters, falling into a deep, dark depression. He had found the key to the cage of human pain, but the world had slammed the door in his face. But Wells wasn't the only one watching that day. In the back of that lecture hall sat his former partner, William Morton. Morton was everything Wells was not. He was cunning, he was greedy, and he was a master of branding. Morton realized that laughing gas was too weak and too unpredictable. He needed something stronger. He started experimenting with a sweet-smelling, highly flammable liquid used by painters to clean brushes. Sulfuric ether. Ether was dangerous. It was explosive. If you inhaled too much, you'd stop breathing forever. But if you got the dose just right, you didn't just giggle, you vanished. You went into a chemical coma so deep that a surgeon could take a saw to your ribs, and you wouldn't even flinch. Morton knew he had the gold, but he didn't want to save the world. He wanted to own it. He disguised the smell of the ether with orange oils and called it Lithion, hoping to patent the gas and charge every doctor in the world for the right to use it. The stage was set for October 16th, 1846, the day the scream finally died. October 16th, 1846. It is a Friday morning in Boston. Inside the amphitheater of the Massachusetts General Hospital, the air is cold and smells of damp wool and floor wax. This room, later known to history as the Ether Dome, is a temple of science, but today it feels like a gallows. The audience is packed with the elite of the medical world. They are skeptics. They remember Horace Wells and his humbug laughing gas. They are here to watch another dentist, William Morton, fail. They want to see a man scream. They want to see the natural order of agony restored. In the center of the room stands the patient, Gilbert Abbott, a young printer with a terrifying tumor on the left side of his neck. He is pale, trembling, and terrified. He knows that in 5 minutes, a man will take a cold steel blade and dig into the most sensitive nerves of his throat. He expects to feel every millimeter of the cut. Morton arrives late. He is carrying a strange glass contraption. He doesn't tell anyone what's inside it. He calls it Lithion, a name stolen from the river Lethe, the river of forgetfulness in Greek mythology. It is, of course, just sulfuric ether mixed with orange oil to hide the chemical stench. Morton leans over Abbott. He places the glass tube in the young man's mouth. "Breathe," Morton whispers. "Just breathe." The room goes silent. You can hear the rhythmic, heavy intake of breath. Hiss, exhale, hiss, exhale. Abbott's eyes begin to roll back, his hands, which were gripping the arms of the chair until his knuckles turn white, suddenly go limp. His head falls to the side. Morton looks up at the lead surgeon, Dr. John Collins Warren, a man who has performed thousands of surgeries and heard tens of thousands of screams. "Your patient is ready, sir," Morton says, his voice steady. Warren makes the incision. It is a deep 5-inch cut. In any other era, this would be the moment the theater erupted in violence. The patient thrashing, the orderlies pinning him down, the blood-curdling shriek that would haunt the students' dreams for years. But today, nothing. Abbott doesn't move. He doesn't flinch. He breathes like a man in a deep, peaceful slumber. Warren continues. He ties off the arteries. He removes the tumor. He stitches the skin. For 10 minutes, the only sound in the room is the clinking of metal instruments and the heavy mechanical breathing of the unconscious man. When Abbott finally blinks his eyes open, Warren leans in close. "Did you feel the cut?" the doctor asks. Abbott looks around the room, dazed. "I felt nothing," he says. "Only a scratch, as if in a dream." Warren turns to the audience. He is visibly shaken. The man who spent 40 years butchering people in the name of health looks at the gallery and utters the most famous words in medical history. "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." You would think this was the end of the story, a happy ending for humanity. But this is history, and history is fueled by ego and greed. What followed was not a celebration, but a decade-long legal knife fight that would destroy everyone involved. The ether war broke out almost immediately. William Morton wanted a patent. He wanted to be the Bill Gates of pain, charging a royalty every time a surgeon used ether. But the medical community was horrified. You couldn't patent a miracle. Then Horace Wells crawled out of his depression, claiming he was the true inventor because he discovered the principle with laughing gas. Then a third man appeared. Charles Jackson, a brilliant but arrogant scientist who claimed he was the one who told Morton to use ether in the first place. The three men spent the rest of their lives in a spiral of lawsuits, pamphlets, and madness. Horace Wells became addicted to chloroform. He eventually moved to New York, went insane, threw sulfuric acid on 2 prostitutes, was arrested, and committed suicide in his jail cell by cutting his femoral artery after anesthetizing himself with chloroform so he wouldn't feel his own death. William Morton spent his entire fortune trying to defend his patent. He died of a stroke at age 48, penniless and forgotten, while reading a newspaper article that credited someone else for his discovery. Charles Jackson went insane after seeing a monument to Morton in Boston. He spent the last 7 years of his life in an asylum, staring at the walls. They gave the world the greatest gift imaginable, the end of agony, and in return, the discovery consumed them whole. By the 1870s, the ether dome had changed everything. You could now go into a hospital for surgery and wake up without a single memory of the pain. But a new problem had emerged. Ether and chloroform were blunt instruments. They didn't just stop the pain, they stopped you. You were in a deep, near-death chemical coma. For a simple procedure, like pulling a single tooth or lancing an abscess on your hand, Knocking someone unconscious was like using a dynamite charge to open a door. It was reckless. Doctors wanted something better. They wanted to turn off the pain, not the person. The answer was waiting for them at the top of the world, in the high Andes of Peru. For thousands of years, the Quechua people had chewed the leaves of the Erythroxylum coca plant. It wasn't a drug to them. It was a divine tool for survival, a way to endure the thin, high-altitude air, to fight off hunger, and to suppress fatigue. When the first Spanish conquistadors arrived, they dismissed it as superstition, until they realized their own soldiers couldn't keep up with the indigenous messengers without it. But it wasn't until 1860 that a German chemist named Albert Niemann finally isolated the active alkaloid, the miracle molecule we now know as cocaine. Niemann didn't see the gold mine. He was a scientist, not a prophet. He died a year later, but he passed his research on to the next generation of doctors in Vienna. And in that generation sat two young, brilliant, and ambitious medical students, Sigmund Freud and Karl Kohler. Freud and Kohler were obsessed with cocaine. Freud was looking for a cure for depression and morphine addiction. He believed cocaine was a divine drug with zero side effects. He would take it before exams, before lectures, before meeting his girlfriend. In his infamous paper, Über Coca, on Coca, he described the sensation as exhilaration and lasting euphoria, a bypass of the body's natural fatigue. But it was Karl Kohler who had the moment of absolute world-changing clarity. Kohler had a dream to become an ophthalmologist, but eye surgery in the 1880s was a nightmare. The eye is the most sensitive organ in the body. You can't just give someone ether and have their head roll to the side. You need their head to be perfectly still, their eye in one position. Without anesthesia, you had to hold the eye open with metal clips while the patient twisted in agony. One night in his lab, Kohler was experimenting with the white powder. He got a small speck on his finger. He absent-mindedly touched his tongue, and it went numb. He didn't make the jump immediately. It seems so obvious now, but the idea of numbing a part of the body was revolutionary. The next day, Kohler made a solution of cocaine, and in a moment that would have made any 19th century medical student gasp, he used a pipette to put a single drop directly into the eye of a dog. Nothing happened. The dog didn't flinch. The probe touched the sensitive cornea. The dog just sat there, looking at Kohler with calm, trusting eyes. Kohler then placed the drop in his own eye. He touched it. Nothing. He then ran to his assistant, placed a drop in his eye, and when the assistant also felt nothing, Kohler went straight to the Vienna Medical Society. He walked in, stood before the most distinguished surgeons in the city, put a drop of cocaine in a patient's eye, and then performed a procedure to remove a piece of metal. The audience was speechless. For the first time, a human was being operated on, fully awake, seeing the blade move towards their face, and they weren't screaming. Cocaine became the new gold rush. Dentists started injecting it into gums. Surgeons started using it on limbs. A brand new field of medicine was born, regional anesthesia. You could now paralyze a nerve and turn off an entire section of the body with a simple injection. But cocaine had a dark side that was darker than any 19th century doctor could imagine. Freud had it wrong. The exhilaration wasn't free. The medical community became the first mass market for cocaine addiction. The doctors who spent their days injecting their patients to study the drug spent their nights injecting themselves. The most tragic figure was William Stewart Halsted, the man known as the father of modern American surgery. Halsted was a giant of medicine. He pioneered the radical mastectomy, the use of sterile gloves, and the teaching system still used in medical schools today. But he also pioneered cocaine-based spinal anesthesia. He and his team would inject themselves in their legs, their arms, and eventually their spinal columns to see how high the numbness could travel. Halsted became a brilliant, hyper-functional addict. He was so addicted that he eventually was sent to an asylum to be cured. He claimed he was, but in reality he just replaced the cocaine with another alkaloid, morphine. Halsted spent the rest of his legendary career as a closeted morphine addict, performing world-changing surgeries while being completely detached from his own body. We had found the key to localized pain, but we had handed it to a molecule that was just as dangerous as the surgeon's blade. We had turned off the scream, but we had turned on the obsession. By the turn of the 20th century, the heroic age of surgery was dead. The surgeons had won. They could cut into the abdomen. They could fix a heart. They could navigate the brain. But they had a new problem. The drugs were almost as dangerous as the disease. Chloroform was killing people on the table from heart failure. Ether was causing massive lung infections. Cocaine was turning the world's best doctors into hollow-eyed addicts. The medical world realized that anesthesia wasn't just a button you pushed to turn off a human being. It was a tightrope walk over a bottomless pit. And so a new figure emerged in the operating theater. A person who didn't hold a scalpel. A person who didn't care about the tumor or the broken bone. This person cared about only one thing: the breath. This was the birth of the anesthesiologist. For decades, giving anesthesia was seen as grunt work. It was often left to the youngest medical student or even the janitor. But as the surgeries became more complex, the grunt work became the most dangerous job in the room. If the surgeon is the pilot of the plane, the anesthesiologist is the person keeping the engines running while the pilot tries to swap out the wings mid-flight. The Great War and the refining of poison. World War I changed everything. On the battlefield of France, surgeons were faced with thousands of men with shattered limbs and shredded lungs. You couldn't give a man with a lung injury ether. It would kill him instantly. You needed something more precise. This led to the development of endotracheal intubation. For the first time, doctors realized they could slide a tube directly into the windpipe. They didn't just let the patient breathe the gas. They controlled the lungs. They became the masters of the breath, the curare revolution, the paralyzed mind. But the biggest horror movie moment in the history of anesthesia came in the 1940s. Doctors discovered a substance used by indigenous hunters in the Amazon, curare. Curare is a muscle relaxant. It doesn't stop pain. It doesn't make you sleep. It simply paralyzes every single muscle in your body, including the muscles you use to breathe. Surgeons loved it. Why? Because when you cut into a stomach, the muscles naturally flinch and tense up. It's like trying to sew a piece of vibrating fabric. Curare turned the human body into a statue. It made the flesh silent. But there was a terrifying catch. In the early days, they didn't realize that curare didn't affect the brain. There are accounts of patients who were given curare, but not enough anesthesia. They lay there, completely paralyzed, unable to move a finger or scream, while they felt every single cut of the knife. They were trapped inside a corpse that could still feel. This led to the modern triple threat of anesthesia that we use today: hypnosis, making you forget; analgesia, stopping the pain; muscle relaxation, making you still. The god of the machine. Today, the anesthesiologist is the most highly trained person in the room. They use drugs like propofol, the milk of amnesia. It's a white, milky liquid that acts so fast that you don't even have time to count to 5. 1 second you are talking about your childhood, and the next you have ceased to exist as a conscious entity. They monitor your brain waves. They know exactly when you are dreaming and when you are sliding too close to the gray zone, the thin line between a deep sleep and brain death. We have reached a point where we can take a human being, stop their heart, drain their blood, keep their brain alive with a machine, and then bring them back to life 3 hours later. To a person from 1840, this wouldn't be medicine. It would be necromancy. We have spent 1,000 years running away from the scream. We have used sponges soaked in poison. We have huffed explosive gases. We have injected ourselves with cocaine, and we have paralyzed our muscles with jungle toxins. But as we sit here in 2026, we have to ask, have we truly conquered pain, or have we just found a way to hide from it? The history of anesthesia is the history of human empathy. We couldn't stand the sound of each other's agony, so we built a wall of chemistry to block it out. But pain is the body's language. When we turned off the scream, we allowed surgery to become routine. We allowed the human body to be treated like a machine that can be taken apart and put back together. Robert Liston, the man who cut off a leg in 28 seconds, would be horrified by a modern surgery. He would think we are slow, lazy, and arrogant. But Gilbert Abbott, the man who felt only a scratch, would look at us as if we were gods. We live in the only era in the history of the earth where pain is an option, not a certainty. That is a miracle, but it's a miracle built on the broken lives of the men who discovered it and the millions of screams that came before them. The next time you sit in a dentist's chair and feel that small, sharp pinch of the needle, followed by the blessed heavy numbness, remember the 300% mortality rate. Remember the laughing gas circus. Remember that for most of human history, that numbness was a luxury that not even kings could buy.